This is a conversation with author and scholar Brian Michael Murphy about the large and complicated data storage industry that follows us all from birth to death and how it's grown over the past several decades. You see it in the explosion of sites like 23andMe and the whole movement toward genealogy, which is only made possible because so many records have begun to be digitized and stored by these data storage companies. Brian Michael Murphy, as I said, is an author and scholar and a dean at Bennington College. And he's written a fascinating book called We the Dead about the whole data storage industry. Brian Michael Murphy is a native of Columbus, Ohio, where I recently heard him speak. So without further ado, here is my conversation about this really interesting, thought provoking topic with Brian Michael Murphy.
And I was just wondering what made you want to research the data complex and the issues you explore in We the Dead.
Thank you, first of all. And it goes back kind of a long ways. I was in graduate school at Ohio State actually, and I was writing my doctoral dissertation. And I was interested in a lot of different things. But the thing that really caught my attention the most was this archive called the Bettman Archive, which
Mhm.
was a very important archive of about 11 million images. And it was purchased by Bill Gates in the mid 90s. And he had planned on digitizing all of it, but he found that the images were decaying pretty rapidly, and digitization took a lot longer than he thought. So he figured that he needed to build a facility to refrigerate the photos, and that took the form of a 10,000 square foot freezer, basically, that was located 220 feet underground in the Iron Mountain National Data Center. And I thought it was such a science fiction like scenario happening in real life that it really sort of appealed to me. I knew that I needed to choose something that would keep my attention for several years while I was researching it, and it
Mhm.
definitely did that. So I basically, explored this question about, why anyone would do that. I mean, on the surface, it's to preserve the images, and he had this image resource company called Corbis, and he would license the images out. But I thought, like, when did we start trying to preserve these media artifacts or data permanently in this way and go to such extreme measures? So that took me back a couple centuries to sort of look at the origins of all that.
Right, right. Do you feel that so I'm a writer like yourself and also being a filmmaker. I mean, I'm really, interested in how you archive your work, especially now that everything is digital and our laptops are full of files, our phones are full of files. Is Do we just sort of have to come to grips with the fact that there is no such thing as permanent storage, that all files, whatever form they're in, are going to degrade eventually? Or did you come to any conclusions about like archival and what the best process is or best format is for
Yeah, I
storage?
mean, there are advantages and disadvantages to each format.
Hmm.
Digital is pretty expensive if you're talking about large scale archiving,
Hmm.
because you have to migrate the data. You have to move it to a new format. Hard drives don't last forever. Magnetic uh, data doesn't last forever. And every time you migrate it, which really needs to happen every few to several years,
Hmm.
you're gonna lose some things. It just always happens. Things get lost in translation. I'm a big fan of paper in many forms. So if you talk to image permanence experts, for instance, and you ask them, like, what's the best way for me to preserve my digital photos, they'll say print them. So because with very little effort or with no effort at all, printed photograph is going to long outlast something that's stored on some external hard drive in your closet. If you try to fire it up 10 years from now, that stuff's going to be corrupted in some way. So for me, I tend to print a lot of paper as I'm writing and as I'm doing research. I do back things up digitally. I'm pretty basic, honestly. Like, if it's something really important, I'll just like email it to myself. I don't have like a massive cloud storage account or anything. And I think that, within the span of a lifetime, you can save the things that are important. But once you start talking about trying to save something for 500 or 1,000 or 10,000 years, like Bill Gates, you get into some pretty strange territory. And actually, it's really the ancient data technologies that last longer. If you want to etch something or use like a really high quality paper, if you want to save something for thousands of years, that's really the way to do it. There have been a few digital solutions that try to work for that long. There's a product called the M-Disc. The company went out of business, but you can still buy them. And it's basically a DVD, but they have embedded a layer of synthetic rock so that the data is actually etched into that rather than, you know, written in dye like a typical CD would
Wow.
be. But again, you have an issue because that thing may persist for 5 or 10,000 years, but there's not going to be any computers to read it. So it's a bit ineffective in the end.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said about paper being the best, I guess, archival system, because I think a lot of people have the opposite concept. They think that, especially with medical records, you know, and like things like birth certificates. I mean, we've all heard about, like, you know, people, Hurricane Katrina victims who,
Sure.
you know, they will never find their original birth certificate because it washed away in the floodwaters, or
Sure.
papers that burned up in a fire, or photographs, you know, that were lost in a tornado or something.
Yeah.
So it just seems like there's no, there's nothing permanent on Earth. Should
There's
we?
not.
Yeah.
Well, and also, you know, guess what happens if a tornado hits a data center?
Right.
That stuff's gonna be gone too, you know? Digital things can burn up too. Like, you know, digital doesn't escape any of those earthly threats. But this is part of the reason why, you know, there are a lot of people in the tech world, or at least there are a few eccentric billionaires and some other folks who are dreaming about going to outer space. And you know, in some ways escaping some of the earthly threats, but of course you have other problems in outer space, like how are you going to breathe? So they're trying to figure all of that out. But you know, we tend to, you know, when we encounter this limit of permanence, we tend to start engaging in all these different kinds of fantasies. And because of the shape of at least Western civilization, if you will, or modern civilizations, because it's not just the West at this point, um, we tend to turn to technology. And we've been taught by marketing and by culture and by ideology to believe that technology can solve our problems. And there are many problems that technology has solved, or at least have addressed in really effective ways. But the impermanence of all matter in any given form, technology is only going to solve that temporarily, and that's okay, right? But we get wrapped up in the fantasy that we can actually outwit mortality or death or flux or impermanence or whatever, you know, sort of inevitable force is there.
Right, right. Do you think there's maybe a disconnect between different generations who grew up with physical media and maybe, I don't know, Gen Z and younger who have grown up as, you know, what they call digital natives? An example is, like, I recently put a family photo on Facebook, and my mom and my grandmother both asked me for copies of this photo. And I was thinking, don't you realize the reason why I put it on social media so I don't have to make copies to get to everyone? Do you think that maybe the generations, and I always think of, you know, I'm Generation X. I always think of, I call it the last generation of concrete and steel, meaning that we grew
Uh,
up with, Generation X grew up with analog, but we also, you know, were young enough when the transition to digital came along. We weren't totally, it wasn't something of totally foreign concept. So do you think there's maybe a generational divide with the way things are stored and archived and just posted,
well,
I
I
guess?
think, yeah, I mean, I think there's a divide and there's a connection. So part of the divide is just the world doesn't look the way that it did. Like you literally can't do things you used to be able to do. I mean, when I was in college, I could go to the Cord camera on Main Street there in Bexley and, you know, have photos printed or get doubles, you know, like we still did that. When I studied abroad, it was like, you know, you're going to get your roll of film developed and your friends are like, oh, get doubles because I'm going to want some. I'm like, you get doubles and then you give me some of yours. Um, Young people don't have that experience because those places kind of don't exist anymore. I mean, they're here and there, but you know, a lot of that is done online. So I think, you know, and that, but that was also part of a whole, as you said, like with the concrete and steel idea, that was a part of a whole world that was analog, right? There used to be payphones, right? There
Mhm.
used to be all of these different kinds of resources for navigating the world. And all of that has been sort of condensed down to the smartphone and an internet connection. So I think that just experientially, there's not there's a disconnection because there's no way for us of our age to communicate like what it was like to live in that world. So that's sort of the disconnect. The connection though is the younger generations are nonetheless nostalgic for that time that they never experienced, and probably maybe even more nostalgic in an ironic way for this time they never experienced, because they do hear what was good about it. They do watch movies and TV shows set at that time. Like I didn't watch Stranger Things, but I guess there's some kid in there that has like, you know, he's this super kind of like analog deals, like walkie talkies. Like there's all this stuff involved that like, you know, kids don't really play with anymore. So um, I think there's a connection and a disconnection. And then, you know, the reality too is that the other disconnection I'd say is that our brains are different. So when you are raised from the time of a child and you're immersed in screens, and I would argue more importantly, when your parents are immersed in screens as they're raising you, it really deeply shapes you. Um, and so they literally have different brains. And also when you combine that with, at least in this country, two very intense shifts that happened in the first decade of the 20th century, it has pretty significant effects. One of those was 9/11 and the global war on terror. So you have young people who've grown up in sort of this post 9/11 world of constant securitization, constant states of emergency, constant, you know, senses of threat being generated by the government. That combined with also George W. Bush policy, which was No Child Left Behind, which radically um, shifted the way that we educate young people, and not in a good way. Much more focused on testing and standardization. So when you combine those three things together, you have this sort of like hyper anxiety, which is, you know, in terms of the geopolitical situation and the way that that's like tuned up by people in power for their own advantage. We know that being on a phone or on social media as a young person just increases anxiety and like all the negative affects that are profitable to these companies. And then you combine that with a sort of educational system that was really broken by the people who are charged with building it and protecting it. And you have, you know, a younger generation that is just built differently. Like they're still creative, they're still brilliant, they're still children with all kinds of potential and possibility. But literally the way they experience and they sense the world is often different from the generation that came before, and in a way that's different from other generational differences in the past. Like no technology has pervaded life the way that the smartphone and social media has, and it's unprecedented.
Yeah, I have young family members who are Generation Z, and I just don't know if it's because I'm boring, but they're very nonverbal around me. It's like
Yeah.
they're scrolling on whatever it is, TikTok or it's Instagram or whatever it is, the whole time that they're, you know, at a family gathering. And partly that can be blamed, you know, on their parents who don't make a rule, you know, no devices during dinner or whatever. But I just wonder, you know, are they really talkative around their friends, their peers, when they feel more comfortable and they have,
Mm.
you know, the subjects that you know are more relatable, that you know are to be talked about? Or are they just nonverbal? Period. Do you have any sense of that?
Well, I mean, we know that, you know, phones are a part of situations in a very pervasive way, situations that in the past would have brought young people face to face with adults a lot, right? So you have, if you go out to a restaurant, you know, you can look
Mm,
over and see a family and everybody's looking at their phone. You know, in school, obviously, you know, students either on their phones in school or waiting for the breaks, they can get back to it. So there's just a lot of, and like I said, you know, there's been a lot of demonization of this generation from being on their screens, but you know, there's pretty powerful research that says like it's really like the parent being on a phone when they're raising the kid that really,
mhm.
really deeply shapes the kid, as I said before. So there's just some incredible data. Like, what does it all mean? Is it negative? Is it positive? You know, people can decide for themselves because, you know, I have two kids and it's not easy to figure out how to you know raise them and sort of prepare them for the world and connect them socially when everybody's using this technology, like all that's challenging to navigate. But there's some incredible data out there. I mean, there's data out there about how like the amazing percentage of people who after having sex, for instance, the first thing they do is check their phone. There's amazing numbers percentages No, there's amazing percentages of
Right.
people who check their phone during sex.
Wow.
So
Wow.
there's, you know, that is objectively different. Like you couldn't do that in the 80s if you wanted to. What does that mean? Is it better? Is it worse? I don't tend to get into that too much, but I definitely noticed, having taught in higher education since the early 2000s. I noticed some big differences after social media came along, took hold. Um, that having office hours with students, I noticed a lot more students who, as you said, they just didn't really seem equipped,
Mhm.
and they seemed pretty anxious, and it seemed pretty new to them when they had an adult sitting in front of them and talking with them. And honestly, I think, going back to the parents on the screens again, I think I wonder sometimes if what was really sort of startling to them was an adult being with them who was truly present, like
Okay.
truly listening to what they're saying, truly asking them questions and waiting for an answer. And there was no mediation in between. I wasn't on my phone, they weren't on theirs, we weren't both on it. It was just like me and them. And I noticed, I remember in about 20, I really started noticing like 2014 or so. Because then you have people who, basically came of age, in early adolescence in a post Facebook world.
Right, right.
So this is anecdotal. I'm sure you can find research out there on these trends, but I mean, I saw it in a sort of anecdotal way. And it was a pretty
Right,
stark
right.
shift over the course of like two or 3 years.
So I'm interested in your perspective, both what consumers are supposed to do and what historians are supposed to do about the shift to like digital archiving. Because, like, for example, as a consumer, like, when you were talking about Mountain, I was really fascinated because I'm a huge
Mhm.
Prince fan, and I know that the Prince estate had moved his recordings from Paisley Park to Iron Mountain at one point. Now they're back to, I think, Paisley Park because the family got control of the catalog again. But if the estate has some kind of you know contract issue with Amazon or Spotify,
Mhm.
all of a sudden one of the albums or one of the songs will disappear from the catalog that I'm listening to, and it's like, well, thank God I have the CDs or the vinyl or the cassette
Yeah.
as a backup. But once they stop making CD players, and once my old cassette Walkman dies, I'll never be able to have this backup. So, number one, what are consumers supposed to do? And then number two, if everything is stored on the quote unquote cloud, and the cloud, blows up and disappears one day, and everything in it gets swallowed up, how will historians know this era? You can look at, the boomer generation, you can look at album covers, you can look at vinyl, you can look at
Mhm.
posters, you can look at magazines, you can look at books, newspapers. What will historians do if all this digital stuff, just goes away because the satellites get blown up by an asteroid, or
Yeah.
something happens?
Or even just a few companies merge into one, and the
Yeah,
one company that, like you said, this catalog like changes ownership, right? What if they decide like, oh, we're pulling back resources from that segment of our business,
right.
and then maybe a whole segment of like music history is gone. um well, I think that in some ways this is just a continuation of the way it's always been. Archives have always been fragmentary. They've always been like the selected fragments out of which the stuff that has survived, and that's what historians have to work with. There still are, and I know you know this because of your work, but there are still oral history possibilities that are at least as powerful in many ways, and as having material artifacts that we will still have with us in these past experiences, in these past musical forms can be described. Um, but I think that as we digitize, we really do create the possibility of more things being lost because of the massive resource investment that's required for digital. I mean, to produce digital, at least in its current form, hard drives and all of the microchips and everything that's required. I mean, it's a global infrastructure of mining, and logistics that has to come together for those devices to exist for the few years that they exist, and then they're thrown in a wasteland. So yeah, I think we run a real danger if we are just digitizing things and saying that's going to save things going forward. And the preservationists that I studied in my book, this is what they figured this out in the 20s and 30s. They said we can't just save in the new medium, we've got to save things in older media as well, because the newer medium is untested. Digital is pretty tested at this point, but we know too much about it. We know how temporary it really is. So this is kind of how this data complex expands, where we just we preserve in the new, we preserve in the old, we preserve in the ancient, and we just keep backing it up in these loops. But things get lost, things go away. I mean, this is the nature of things to some degree, and that I don't want Prince's music to be lost, but humans create amazing things out of all kinds of contexts. Sometimes because they heard a Louis Armstrong, 78 from 100 years ago, and they're like, that's amazing, right? It's dusty, it's crackling, it's popping, but you can hear how amazing the music is underneath. And then maybe sometimes there's a work of art, or there is a creative achievement that you can't get to anymore in that way, but it can be described, and that too can inspire future humans. Like, you don't necessarily need the thing, just for that thing to be sort of passed on in some way, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
So
it's almost like we'd be returning to the cavemen sitting around the fire telling, or not cavemen, but I guess whatever the people who came after the cavemen, sitting around and telling stories around the fire, oral traditions like that.
yeah, I mean, that's always there. Humans have been doing that for a very long time. We're pretty good at it. And there's yeah. So I think that it's a strange sort. It's almost like a paradox, right?
Hmm.
Oftentimes, like, imagine in the future if all these things had been lost. But if they were lost and you didn't know they were there, you wouldn't see them as lost. You just don't know that they were there at all, right? So if all of Prince's music got lost, and then it's like next year, and then it's 50 years from now, are people going to be lamenting the thing that was lost if they don't even know that it was there in the first place? They're just going to look back and say, well, this is the historical record that we have. We have to work with it. So,
Right. And I just have two last questions, so I want to be
yeah.
respectful of your time. So, do you think it's like people, there's this hyper focus on minimalism now. People want
Mm,
to scan all their photos and throw all the, film
mm.
away, and people want to, let me get rid of my CD collection because everything's streaming now. Do you think that's foolish? That's one question, or not foolish so much as
Yeah.
a little hasty. And then
Okay.
number two, and I asked this during your presentation, the explosion of interest in genealogy. Do you think that was driven by the fact that all these things have started to be archived, or was there always this interest in genealogy and now there's just more access to historical records?
Yeah. So the first thing, I didn't get rid of all my CDs. I did get rid of the cases because I got tired of moving them from one apartment to the next. So I kept like the liner notes and the CD
Yeah.
itself. Um, I get the minimalism trend. There is a risk there. And I think if you are saving things to a digital hard drive in a very specific way, um, outside of a platform, like a corporate platform, then you can have some safety there. One of the things that happened when people uploaded their music collections to iTunes a number of years ago, I don't know if you heard about this, but
Uh-huh.
yeah, so they uploaded all their CDs to iTunes, like, cool, I'll just keep it here. And they thought that what was happening is they had like an independent MP3 file. So it was safe. But what happened was actually Apple was sort of like sending the stuff to the cloud, and then using an algorithm to basically recognize what the song was. And so when you went to play No Woman No Cry, it wouldn't pull it from an independent file on your computer, it would pull it from the cloud. It was something like this, right?
Oh, okay.
But what happened was, let's say you had a cassette tape of some ultra rare live show that Bob Marley did in London in 1976, and your buddy was there, and he had given you this, and you had put it on a CD, you'd burn it onto a CD, and you'd upload it to your computer
Mhm.
throughout the tape and the CD. Well, the algorithm heard it and was like, "Oh, that's No Woman No Cry." You erased the original version that you had, and every time you click play, it just gave you No Woman No Cry that everybody else has. And there were people who were outraged and tried to get in touch with Apple and say, "What's going on here?" And Apple's like, "We can't fix it." So all kinds of people that lost these like really distinctive, recordings that they had digitized. Um, the second question, could you remind me?
About genealogy. Why has genealogy taken off so much in recent years?
Yeah, so if you go back to the late 1800s when the eugenics movement was really taking hold in the United States, um, there was a huge interest in genealogy because these eugenicists were really concerned with discovering where the most, the purest white people were, which families they were. They wanted to basically engineer what they called a better race, right? And so the Eugenics Records Office and all these other organizations, they actually sent these field agents out to do this genealogical work to figure out like where the purest whiteness lived. So that was kind of I would say like a first explosion in that industry. In the 20th century, there have been some other institutions like Church of Latter-day Saints, like the Mormons have these massive archives where they have preserved a lot of material and they have interests in genealogy for their own reasons. But more recently, part of the reason for the explosion with companies like Ancestry.com or 23andMe and these sort of like DNA companies is that the they profit from us giving them their data. So what happens is you pay a fee, and what you think is, I'm paying this fee because they have this massive database, and once they get my DNA, they can figure out like who I'm connected to. And to some degree, that's true. But really, the business model is the more data they collect, the more profitable their database becomes. So what's actually happening is you are you are paying for the privilege of giving them their raw material that makes their business run.
Wow.
So they have created a way of like inverting things. So you think you're buying this service when in actuality they are getting paid to build up and stockpile the sort of profitable load of data points that they can do, really whatever they want with. So there's been a big push in the since the human genome was mapped, there's been a genomics industry, and the genealogy industry is not unrelated to that. So that's part of the reason why we're seeing it explode now. There are probably some other reasons if I thought about it a little bit more, but those are definitely key factors.
Right. Was there anything else about We the Dead or anything I didn't ask about that you wanted to mention?
Um, well, I think you'd asked early in our meeting here, um, about why I ended up writing about it, and I
Mhm.
and I think part of the reason I ended up writing about it is I think humans are pretty fascinating. We do some pretty strange things, and I was really interested in trying to get to what motivates us. In some ways, the book is as much as it's about technology and some of these like arcane historical examples and these preservationists working in obscurity in the 1930s, who actually become forerunners of how all of us live now. As much as it is that, it's also really a project that's about what it means to be human now. And the experience of being human has changed constantly, as long as there have been humans, because we're constantly inventing technology by which we reshape our environment. And the way that evolution works is we then are reshaped by that environment as we adapt to it, and then we use technology to reshape it again. So I guess what I was trying to do in the book is something that I think is pretty hard to do, which is to analyze what's happening in the present as it's happening. Like what is happening to us, as we employ these technologies in such pervasive ways. And that's partly why the end of the book ends in a kind of speculative scenario where I say, like, okay, so if this is where we are now, and these are the trends that we can trace over the past 100 years into the present, what's this going to look like 10 or 20 or 30 years from now? Where is all of this going? So that's basically the arc. So I think it's a book that is, definitely for people who are interested in these topics as I've stated them. But I really wrote it to try to have a broader appeal for anyone who really, which I think is a lot of us, anyone who just wonders, like, I'm using this technology a lot. What's actually going on as I do this? Like, how is this reshaping our society? Like, what choices are we making that could be different? And I think a lot of us are in that situation as, like, we're just every day we're hit with another app, another device. I mean, even when you're at work, they're like, oh, well, if you want to talk to your coworkers, not only do you have to have email, you've got to have Slack, but then this office is using Discord. And you're like, is there a way to say no to this? Because I really would, like, can I call somebody? Like, we all have phones in our offices, and we have phones in our pockets. We can't call. No, I gotta, okay. So
Right.
so it's kind of a whirlwind right now. And I think the book was in some ways my attempt to look at all of it all at once and say, okay, what is this? What kind of human is this technology making now? And is this the human that I want to be? So I think it could help the reader answer that question.
Brian, it's a really, really thought-provoking subject. So thank you so much for the book.
Thank you. Thanks for talking to me.
Yeah, and if people want to like have questions or comments about the book, should they just reach out through your website or social media, or what's the?
Yeah, just reach out on my website. It's brianmichaelmurphy.com. So
Okay.
I'll get all those contact forms.
Awesome.
If you like this video, please leave a comment, share it, and subscribe to my channel.